How's it going, everybody? Derek from Make Media Studios, and today we're going to be doing something just a little bit different. This is Cinematography 101. This is your crash course, and this is part 1. This week, I'm just going to go over DSLR mirrorless cinema camera settings and basics you need to know for video recording. This is just a basic run through. We're going to go over some terminology and different things that create proper exposure in your camera and make an image look good when it's recorded into your camera. First though, if this is your first time to the channel, make sure you go down below and hit subscribe. Smash that like button and leave a comment if you have any questions along the way. So this is, again, Crash Course Cinematography 101. This is going to be a new series that I'm going to do, kind of a Derek Explains. So this is just like a part 1 of this because there's so many layers to cinematography and things you can do. All right, let's just go over some housekeeping terms to figure out how a camera records video and just kind of how that light goes through the lens to a sensor and how it is processed. Okay, so this is real simple. The first thing is the lens. Okay, so the lens is the optics on front of the camera that's going to take the light coming in and focus it onto the sensor of the camera, which creates the image. There, the next part is your sensor. Okay, we have a lens and a sensor. The lens is the optics that focuses the light onto the image sensor or the image plane. Those are your two items that create that image. Okay, but now there's different settings. There's 3 different terms you need to know: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. With these 3 things, you create a correct exposure. All right, let's start with aperture. Aperture is actually a circle on the back of your lens that lets a certain amount of light into the sensor. So that can be wide open is a term you'll hear, which means that the aperture is fully open or at like an f2.8 or an f1.8. That is a full open aperture. Okay, that's letting as much light as that lens can into the sensor. If you're at like an f16, maybe an f22, that is really small hole. That's letting little bit of light, the least amount it can, into the sensor. You're going to use an aperture to determine, in a room, depending on how much light you have. Right now, I'm shooting at like a 3.2, but I'm in a dark room and I'm using lighting, so I'm able to achieve a correct exposure using the next couple parts. So there's shutter speed, okay? So first you have aperture, then you have shutter speed, and you have ISO in this triangle. So shutter speed. So simply a shutter in a camera is a window that's opening and closing and letting light onto a sensor at a certain interval of time. Okay, so it's usually based off the 180-degree shutter rule, which is going to be that for every frame, you want the shutter to be open for half of that frame amount. So 24p, you're probably going to be setting to a 1/50 shutter. Okay, so that means that the shutter will be open for 1/50th of a second. That is exactly half of one frame of the 24p, because there's 24 frames in a second. 1/50th is going to be about 1/2 of every frame will be exposed or open. If you set it to 124 shutter and you have 24p, that means the shutter is going to be open for the entire frame, which is going to give a lot of ghosting, is what it's called. The amount of motion blur in a shot will exaggerate more. So when I put my hand up like this, you get a 180-degree shutter. This amount of blur you see on my hand is based off the 180-degree shutter rule. You can do that at 24p, setting it to 1/50. You set that to 1/24, you're going to get a lot more blur. Cinematically, you might use that. You can change shutter speed for different aspects. A higher shutter speed, making that it only exposes that sensor for a quick amount of time to that 24p frame. For action, it really gets rid of all this blur. It makes it, I'll show you a scene from Kernwick that I did where we shot that at a high shutter speed so that every movement, you can see everything about it. Same thing with like basketball and sports. Those are going to be a higher shutter film, and they're also not shot at 24p. Sports is shot at like 60p, and the shutter is synced with that, so you see like the basketball flying through the air without any blur, so you see every moment. So that's shutter speed. Again, back to this exposure triangle. To create exposure, you're going to set your shutter, your aperture, and your ISO. So the third thing, ISO. ISO is the gain of the sensor. So this is how much that sensor is sensitive to light. So normally, let's say an ISO of 100 is the lowest it can go, and we'll put a high mark of 51,000 ISO, okay? You're probably never going to film at 51,000 ISO. It's going to be way too grainy. As you turn up the ISO, you're introducing more noise into the frame as the gain gets higher. With a Sony a7 III, like I shoot with, I can shoot at like 3200 or 6400 ISO and really get little grain because their sensor is just so advanced. So when I shot with a red at like 3200, at least like the lower end reds that I've shot with, they will introduce a lot more grain at a higher ISO. Now we've kind of gone over these housekeeping terms, okay? The exposure triangle. There's 3 parts to it. Now, shutter is pretty much always constant. So the 2 things that you change to create a correct exposure is either open up your aperture and let more light in, or you turn up the gain of the sensor to make it more sensitive to light. Depending if it's too dark, if it's too bright, you adjust those. That is the exposure triangle. I was taught this a long time ago as a photographer, and that's kind of where I learned it and where I started. So exposure triangle, that's what you want to, in photography, you're going to use all 3 because you can change the shutter. But in videography, you keep that one constant, and then you just adjust the other 2 to create the correct exposure. All right, let's just go over some other like settings inside of a mirrorless camera, okay? There's usually 3 record modes when it comes to video on a camera. Some have it, not all do, but with my Sony and other like Canon cameras, you're gonna have manual video recording, you're gonna have what's called aperture priority, and you're gonna have something called shutter priority. So manual is full manual. You choose everything in that exposure triangle like I was saying, and you make it to what you want, and those settings don't change. Aperture priority is going to have you set the camera to say f3.2, so then the camera will adjust the shutter and the ISO as it feels necessary to create a properly exposed shot. It's not the best idea when you're filming cinematic stuff. The camera could mess up. You're going to have, it goes bright, it goes dark. You want settings to be very constant. You want locked down settings is what I call it. So manual mode is the mode I shoot in all the time. I don't use an aperture priority, and shutter priority is pretty much auto video. You're going to set it to 1/50 shutter for 24p filming, and then it will adjust the aperture, it'll adjust the ISO, and it's going to do whatever it wants to do to create an exposed shot. Vlogging might be a reason you'd use this, but if you are filming something for a client interview, you should have lockdown settings and lockdown lighting. And if you're moving from room to room, that's when you need to just change your settings on your camera. Now, some advanced cameras like the FX9 right now by Sony, and I've seen some reviews about it, they have this, auto face exposure setting now where it keeps that face exposed correctly and it doesn't jump around a lot. And it looks really good. So maybe as technology advances, more auto video settings won't be as bad. But if you're on a major film set or a big production, everything they shoot on is going to be manual settings. They're going to choose the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter, and nothing's going to change automatically in the camera. All right, so another setting in your camera that you're going to want to be concerned with is your frame rate. This is what I was talking about earlier about 24p. Your main frame rates inside of a DSLR or cinema camera are going to be 24p, 30p, 60p, 120p, and you might even have 240, 960, crazy Ps on the other end, or really high frame rate video on the higher end cameras. But your main 24, 30, 60, 120. That's your 3 main frame rates, okay? So frame rates, 30p is what I was told was internet video, which was interview style, just kind of not really cinematic or film, but 30p was kind of an internet video base. I make internet videos for customers. I use 24p all the time. So 30p is not really something I ever use. 24p though is kind of your cinematic standard. Like I said, that motion blur, right? At 24p, you're going to have more motion blur, but it looks more natural to what you see in film and different movies, and it's just comes natural to our eye because we've looked at it for so long. 60p is more like sports. You could film and show something at 60p, and it would be, like I said, there's not going to be very much blur in there. You're going to have a lot more crisp images the whole time, and you're gonna see it like lifelike. That's the whole thing. 60p is also used for slow motion. Okay, so you can take a 60p video and pull it into a 24p timeline in Premiere Pro and slow it down. So if you have 60 frames per second and you had a 24p, you can get almost 2.5 times slower. You can play back that footage slower. B-roll. That's what I would use 60p for. I just made a Doritos commercial. I dropped Doritos in a bag or into a bowl, and I'm going to shoot that at 60p, and I'm going to slow it down into 24p. So all 24 frames in that sequence or that video I'm making has a frame from the 60p file, slowing it down, stretching that 60p over 24. Hard to explain, but I'll go a little more into depth into that in the future. Again, that's the same thing with 120p. 120p is another slow-mo setting. You can shoot at 120p, bring it into a 24p timeline, and you can get super slow-mo footage. So those are your frame rates. I suggest shooting at 24p for interviews and people, and shooting at 60 and 120 for B-roll and things you want to slow down and make them look kind of milky smooth, stuff like that. I've heard some people use 30p on drones. Just to, you can take that 30p sequence and slow it down to 24p just a little bit. And then that just slows it down and makes it a little bit more smooth. The trees wave a little bit slower. It could work for you. But 24p is what I use the most. 60 and 120 are the other two. The one last thing when you're making the correct exposure, you want to look at your white balance. So in this filming situation right now, I'm using what's called a daylight balanced light. This thing is at 5600 Kelvin, okay? Kelvins is the temperature range for light. Our eyes automatically adjust white balance. When we're outside in the daylight and we see a piece of white paper, it looks white. When you're inside of a house with maybe house lighting, those orange lights, and you hold up a white piece of paper, it looks white. But a camera can't do that without you choosing the white balance for it. It needs to know if it's in a room with tungsten lights, those yellow house lights. It needs to know if it's in a room like that. If it's in a room like that, you're going to set your camera to, let's say, like 3600 Kelvin. Okay, that is what tungsten lights read in the Kelvin spectrum. So you set your camera to 3600 Kelvin, or roughly, you look at a white piece of paper and you can kind of dial in your camera and find the correct spot. Also, cameras have auto white balance. You don't want to use auto white balance because it starts to fluctuate colors while you're filming. And then daylight balance lights like this, I'm shooting at 5600 Kelvin in the camera because this is a more daylight. It's not yellow. It's more towards the blue, okay? 3200 Kelvin's more towards the orange. 5600 Kelvin's more towards the blue. So that's what you're going to do. You're setting your white balance in your camera to find what white looks naturally to the eye. So make sure you check your white balance. All right, and I think the last thing I want to go over is after you've set all this up on your camera, you're going to want to choose either autofocus or manual focus, okay? This is going to be a switch in your camera to choose between either or. If you're doing an interview like this, I would suggest choosing manual focus, setting the focus to the eye of the person at the chair and leaving it there. So that the camera is not hunting for focus if they move in or they move out. You might have noticed that my camera kept me in focus. I'm actually using autofocus right now. So if I come in all the way to here, it's going to keep me in focus. If I come all the way back here, it's going to keep me in focus. I trust Sony a7 III autofocus because it's looking at my eye right now. But if you have a smaller, lower-end camera, or you have a fancy red that do not have autofocus capabilities like this camera does, I wouldn't trust it. That's why most cinematographers shoot in manual mode all the time. I'm the exception. I do shoot in auto a lot now. I do trust my camera to get the shot I want. I've seen reviews now of the FX6 and the FX9, these higher end Sony cinema cameras, that their animal eye track focus is so good that you don't need a focus puller. In a lot of situations, I don't have another person with me to use like a focus pulling system to make sure my focus is perfect on set. So when I'm running around or chasing someone that they can be tracking that, I have to use autofocus. Major cinematographers though, they have someone on set that's recording that's hitting the record button and adjusting focus for them. Okay. This was Cinematography 101, Crash Course Part 1. Went over a lot of stuff today. If it didn't make any sense to you, give me a comment below. I'll try to answer your questions and link you to maybe some material that have helped me learn what these things, but this is just your basics, okay? These are just some terminology you need to know to understand how light comes through a lens into a sensor on your camera, and then you pull that memory card and you put it in your computer and you have a video file. That's what we just went over right now and what you need to do to make sure it looks good. There's so many more things to go over in the future. This was just part 1. If you like this video, hit the like button down below. If you haven't subscribed yet, help us out. Subscribe. We got that red button down there, and guess what? If you click it, it turns gray. So please like, subscribe, share with a friend, and we'll see you in the next episode of Cinematography 101. Thank you for watching. Wait, stop. Look, there's more things that you can still do. Look, if you minimize whatever video you're currently watching of mine and you scroll down a little bit, there's going to be this red subscribe button. You know what you do? You click it. Check this out. Ready? Watch. It's crazy. It goes from red to gray. Right? Blew my mind. I want you to check to see if yours goes from red to gray. And I want you to leave a comment down below if it did. And that's about it. Now you're at the end of the video. Go on ahead and watch